In 1962, a 10-year-old boy in New York fell in love with the worst baseball team in the history of the sport. The New York Mets had just been formed, and they lost their first 10 games. Their roster was a collection of aging, worn-out players who probably should have already retired. Men who had nothing left to prove, but were giving everything they had anyway. Most kids rooted for winners. This boy rooted for them. "I was just struck with their desire to go someplace," he'd later say. "I was swept away with the excitement of the underdog." That boy was Dean Sycon, and that instinct, that pull toward the struggling, the overlooked, the fighting against the odds, would quietly shape every single chapter of his life. Dean didn't just cheer for underdogs from the bleachers. He defended them in the hallways. Throughout his school years, even though he wasn't particularly big, Dean had a habit of stepping between bullies and their targets. Something in him simply couldn't walk past injustice without doing something about it. By the time he was a teenager, he had already formed a belief that would anchor his entire adult life. If you push hard enough for the right thing can actually happen. But it took a television broadcast to show him exactly how. One evening in high school, Dean was watching the news when President Lyndon Johnson came on screen to announce the suspension of bombing in North Vietnam. The country had been at war. People had been in the streets. And now, because of that pressure, because of those voices, a president had blinked. Dean watched, and something clicked. I realized the only reason he did that was because people were in the streets expressing their outrage. And at the head of those people were social justice lawyers. William Kunstler in particular. He turned off the television knowing exactly what he wanted to do with his life. He was going to become a lawyer, not to make money, not for prestige, to be the person at the front of the crowd, fighting for the people no one else was fighting for. Dean became a lawyer, and while he took on other legal work to pay the bills, his heart belonged to a specific cause: the struggles of Native Americans fighting to hold onto their land and their culture. Word traveled fast. On what he affectionately called the tom-tom telephone, news spread that there was a young lawyer willing to show up, really show up, for indigenous peoples taking on governments and corporations. Calls started coming in from across the United States, then Canada, then Latin America, then beyond. He was doing what so few people get to do early in life, exactly what he was built for, and the world was responding. A lecture Dean gave at the University of Rhode Island about Brazilian farmers would turn out to be one of the most consequential talks of his life, though he had no way of knowing it at the time. After he finished speaking, a professor approached him. The professor had a friend who owned a coffee shop in Providence. This friend bought coffee from Brazil and had recently learned something troubling. The farmers who grew that coffee were receiving almost none of the money being made from it. They were living in poverty while their product filled cups in comfortable cafes thousands of miles away. The friend wanted to help, but didn't know how. Could Dean advise? Dean said yes. And then he did what Dean Sycon always does. He went further. In 1993, Dean co-founded Coffee Kids, the world's first non-profit organization working directly in coffee-growing communities. He traveled to villages, sat with farmers, and helped design programs addressing their most pressing needs: clean water, schools, income. It was meaningful, hands-on, boots-on-the-ground work that made a real difference to real people. But after several years, something started to bother him. The coffee companies donating to these programs were giving a few $1,000s, and then turning around and advertising to their customers as though they were transforming the world. The cycle of poverty in those villages? Still intact. The company's fundamental behavior? Unchanged. Dean started asking a different kind of question. Not, how do we help farmers on the side? But what if a company was built from the ground up to treat farmers fairly and was still profitable? That question became an obsession, and the obsession became a business. Dean's Beans was born with a radical premise: that a company could engage directly with the communities it's sourced from, pay fair prices, invest in real development, and still make money. That being a sensitive, caring business person and being profitable were not mutually exclusive, that in fact, they could reinforce each other. At the time, people were skeptical. The business world didn't talk like this. This was the language of charities, not companies. Dean didn't care. He'd spent his whole life fighting for things people said couldn't be done. 18 years later, Dean's Beans was a thriving company selling coffee online, in retail stores, and in coffee bars. It worked directly with farmers in 14 countries, building equitable development programs in each one. And Dean built every one of those partnerships himself, in person, on the ground. He traveled to places that were, by his own admission, sometimes physically dangerous, frequently challenging to one's health, and occasionally involving standing naked in front of 7,000 people in Papua New Guinea. If I were a timid person, I couldn't do this, he said. But Dean is not a timid person. He loves adventure. He loves travel. He loves different cultures. He loves to explore. For him, social justice and personal joy were not in tension. They were the same thing. Dean Sykon's story is not just an inspiring biography. It's a proof of concept. He proved that profit and social conscience can live in the same business. He proved that one person, working from their deepest instincts and their greatest strengths, can build something that changes the lives of farmers in Ethiopia, Peru, Sumatra, and beyond. He proved that adventure, justice, and joy don't have to be separate compartments. They could be one integrated life. He also proved something quieter, and perhaps more important. Happiness is rarely found by looking inward alone. Dean's joy expanded precisely because he kept turning his attention outward, toward the people who needed someone in their corner. There's a beautiful line at the end of Dean's story that deserves to sit with you for a moment. He couldn't do anything to help the 1962 Mets, but that 10-year-old boy who fell in love with a losing team, the one who saw something worth cheering for in people who were struggling, who kept showing up anyway. He never really went away. He just kept finding bigger underdogs to fight for. Coffee farmers in Brazil, indigenous communities in Latin America, villagers in Papua New Guinea. Every one of them, in their own way, the equivalent of a team that lost its first 10 games and needed someone in the stands who believed they were worth showing up for. Here is what Dean Sykon's life asks of us. What are you instinctively, stubbornly, unreasonably drawn to fight for? Not what's practical, not what's expected. What is the thing that has been pulling at you since you were 10 years old? Watching something unfair and feeling it in your chest. Because that pull, that instinct, is not a distraction from your life's work. For Dean, it was his life's work. It became his career, his adventure, his joy, and his legacy all at once. Happiness, it turns out, is not something you find by searching for it directly. It's something you stumble into when you're too busy fighting for something that matters to notice you are looking at all.